Hi 7 and 8, time for Chapter 4 of Johnny Tremain. Chapter 4, The Rising Eye. It was past dawn when he woke, his feeling of contentment still in him. He was no longer his own problem, but Merchant Light's. Tomorrow at this time, what would he be calling him? Uncle Jonathan? Cousin Light? Perhaps Grandpa? And he laughed out loud. Only imagine how Mrs. Latham would come running, dropping nervous curtsies when he drove up in that ruby coach. How Madge and Dorcas would stare. First thing he did would be to take Scylla for a drive. He'd not even invite Azana, but how she would bawl when left behind. And then his imagination jumped ahead. At the Charlestown ferry slip he washed in the cold sea water, and because the sun was warm, sunned himself as he did what he could to make his shabby clothes presentable. He combed his lank, fair hair with his fingers, cleaned his nails with his teeth, and of course now he could buy Scylla that pony and cart. And Grandpa Latham, oh, he'd buy him a Bible with print an inch high in it. Mrs. Latham, not a thing, madam, not one thing. Christ Church said 10 o'clock. He got up and started for the long wharf where his great relative had his counting house. On his way he passed down Salt Lane. There was the comical little painted man observing Boston through his tiny spyglass. Johnny wanted to stop, tell that fellow that rab of his great connections, but he decided to wait until he was sure of his welcome into the Light family. Although half of him was leaping ahead, imagining great things for himself, the other half was wary. It was quite possible he would get no welcome at all, and he knew it. He walked half of the length of the long wharf until he saw carved over the door the familiar rising eye. The door was open, but he knocked. None of the three clerks sitting on their high stools with their backs to him, scratching in ledgers, looked up, so he stepped inside. Now that he had to speak, he found there was a barrier across his throat, something that he would have to struggle to get his voice over. He was more excited than he had realized, but he was scornful too. These three clerks would not even look up when he came in today, but tomorrow what would it be? Good morning, little master. I'll tell your uncle, cousin, father, grandfather that you're here, sir. Finally, a well-fed, rosy youth, keeping one finger in his ledger, swung around and asked him what he wanted. It's a personal matter between myself and Mr. Light. Well, said the young man pleasantly, even if it is personal, you'd better tell me what it is. It's a family matter. I cannot, in honor, tell anyone except Mr. Light. One of the elderly clerks laughed in a mean way. Just another poor suitor for the hand of Miss Lavinia. The young clerk flushed. Johnny had seen enough of Madge and Dorcas and their suitors to know that the gibe about poor boys aspiring to Miss Lavinia had gone home. Tell him, snickered the other ancient spider of a clerk, that Mr. Light is, sensible of the great honor, and regrets to say he has formed other plans for his daughter's future. Ah! Evidently he mimicked Mr. Light. The young clerk was scarlet. He flung down his pen. Can't you ever forget that? He protested. Here, kid, and turned toward Johnny. Mr. Light's closeted behind that door with two of his sea captains. When they leave, you just walk in. Johnny sat modestly on a stool, his arrogant, shabby hat in his good hand, and looked about him. The three backs were bent once more over the ledgers. The quill pens scratched. He heard the gritting of sand as they blotted their pages. There was a handsome half-model of a ship on the wall. Sea chests, doubtless full of charts, maps, invoices, were under the desks. The door opened. Two ruddy men with swaying walks stepped out, and Mr. Light himself was shaking hands, bidding them success on their voyaging, and God's mercy. As he turned to go back to his sanctuary, Johnny followed him. Mr. Light sat himself in a red leather armchair beside an open window. Through that window he could watch his western star graving in the graving dock. He would have been a handsome man, with his fine dark eyes, bushy black eyebrows, contrasting smartly with the white tie wig he wore, except for the color and quality of his flesh. It was as yellow as tallow. Seemingly it had melted and run down. The lids were heavy over the remarkable eyes. The melted flesh made pouches beneath them. It hung down along his jawbone under his jutting chin. "What is it?" he demanded. "Who let you in? What do you want, and who, for heaven's sake, are you?" "Sir," said Johnny, "I'm Jonathan Light Tremaine." There was a long pause. The merchant's glittering black eyes did not waver, nor the tallow cheeks redden. If the name meant anything to him, he did not show it. "Well?" "My mother, sir." The boy's voice shook slightly. "She told me, she always said—" Mr. Light opened his jeweled snuff box, took snuff, sneezed, and blew his nose. "I can go on from there, boy. Your mother on her deathbed told you you were related to the rich Boston merchant." Johnny was sure now Mr. Light knew of the relationship. "Yes, sir, she did, but I didn't know you'd know." "No? I didn't need to know. It's a very old story, a very old trick. And will you be gone, or shall I have you flung out?" "I'll say," Johnny said stubbornly, "seawall." The merchant did not raise his voice, but instantly the young clerk was on his threshold. "Show him out, Seawall. And happens he lands in the water. You, can baptize him with my name. Ah, ha ha." Mr. Light took up a handful of papers. The incident was over. Seawall looked at Johnny, and Johnny at Seawall. The young man was as kind as his cherubic face suggested. "I can prove to you one thing, Mr. Light. My name is Jonathan Light Tremaine." "What of it? Any back-alley dab-tail can name her child for the greatest man in the colony. There should be a law against it, but there is none." Johnny's temper began to go. "You flatter yourself. What have you ever done except be rich? Why, I doubt even a monkey mother would name a monkey child after you." Mr. Light gave a long whistle. "That was quite a mouthful, Seawall." "Yes, sir." "You just take this monkey child of a monkey mother out and drown it." "Yes, sir." Seawall put a soft hand on the boy's shoulder, but Johnny fiercely shook himself free. "I don't want your money," he said more proudly than accurately. "Now that I've met you face to face, I don't much fancy you as a kin. Your manners, my boy, are a credit to your mother. But facts are facts, and I have a cup with your arms in it to prove what I say is true." The merchant's unhealthy, brilliant eyes quivered and glittered. "You've got a cup of mine?" "No, of mine." So you've got a cup. Will you describe it?" Johnny described it only as a silversmith could. "Why, Mr. Light, that must be—" Seawall began, but Light hushed him. Evidently, not only Mr. Light, but his clerks had heard of this cup. Johnny was elated. "My boy," said the merchant, "you have brought me great news. I must see your cup." "Any time you say, sir." "My long-lost cup returned to me by my long-lost little whatever you are, Kirchu." He had taken more snuff. "Bring your cup to me tonight. You know my Beacon Hill house?" "Yes, sir." "And we'll kill the fatted calf, you long-lost whatever you are. Come an hour after candles are lit. Prodigal son, what? Got a cup, has he?" We're still in Chapter 4 of Johnny Tremaine, Part 2. Although Johnny might have been more cordially received by Merchant Light, he was satisfied enough with his welcome to build up air castles. He really knew they were air castles, for at bottom he was hard-headed, not easily taken in even by his own exuberant imagination. Still, as he trudged up Fish Street, turned in at the Latham store, in his mind he was in that ruby coach, money and a watch in his pocket. He had hoped to slip to the attic and fetch away his cup without being noticed, but Mrs. Latham saw him enter and called him into the kitchen. She said nothing about his shoes. Evidently the girls had told her his story, and she had believed it. "Johnny, you come set a moment. No, girls, you needn't leave. I want you to hear what I'm going to say." Johnny looked a little smug. Had he not almost arrived in the light coach? "Grandpa says as long as he lives you are to have a place to sleep. But you've got to go back to the attic. Mr. Tweedy to have the birth and death room, and you can have a little somewhat to eat. I've agreed that's all right. I'll manage somehow. Don't fret, I'm good for good. I'm going for good. I'll believe that when I see it. Now mind, I've 2 things to say to you." The 4 girls were all sitting about, hands folded as though they were first meeting. "First, you shan't insult Mr. Tweedy. Least not until he has signed the contract. No more talk of being a spinster, of his being a spinster aunt dressed up in men's clothes. And no more squeak pigs, he's sensitive. You hurt his feelings horribly. He almost took ship then and there back to Baltimore. I'm sorry. Secondly, there's to be no more talk of you and Scylla. Don't you ever dare lift your eyes to one of my girls again." "Lift my eyes? I can't see that far down into the dirt even to know they are there." "Now you sauce-box, you hold that tongue of yours. You're not to go hanging round Scylla, giving her presents, and dear knows how you got that money. I've told her to keep shy of you. Now I'm telling you, you mark my words. Ma'am, I wouldn't marry that sniveling, goggle-eyed frog of a girl even though you gave her to me on a golden platter. Fact is, I don't like girls, nor with a black look at this mistress, woman either. That goes for Mr. Tweedy, too." He left to go upstairs for his cup. When he came down, the more capable women of the household were out in the yard hanging up the wash. Scylla was paring apples in the deft, absent-minded way. In that deft, absent-minded way, she did such things. Azana was eating the parings. She'd been sick before nightfall. Scylla lifted her pointed, translucent little face. Her hazel eyes, under their veil of long lashes, had a greenish flash to them. There never was a less goggle-eyed girl. "Johnny's mad," she said sweetly. "His ears are red. He is mad," Azana chanted. These words sounded wonderful to him. He was happy because once more they were insulting him. They were not pitying him or being afraid of him because he had had an accident. Goggle-eyed, sniveling frogs! With his silver cup and his flannel bag, he set off to kill time until he might take it to Mr. Light. He spent a couple of hours dreaming of his rosy future, and the tears in Merchant Light's unhealthy, brilliant black eyes, the tremor in his pompous ah-ha-ha manner of speech as he clutched his long-lost whatever you are to his costly waistcoat. Even if he did not like women, Miss Lavinia, he decided, was to kiss him on the brow. Through this dreaming, he felt enough confidence in his good fortune at last to stop in to see that Rab. There had not been a day since the first meeting that he had not wanted to. Rab showed no surprise either over his return or the strange story that he had proceeded to pour out. It was nightfall, and as Johnny hoped, Uncle Lorne and the little Webbs were gone. Rab was waiting for the ink to dry on the Observer so he could fold it. He sat with his long legs stretched before him, his hands clasped behind his back. "Light's crooked, you know," he said at last. "I've heard that before. He's sly. When the merchants agreed not to import any English goods until the Stamp Act was repealed, he was one of the first to sign, then imported secretly, sold through another name, made more money. Sam Adams spoke to him privately and scared him. He says he won't do that again. He's trying to ride 2 horses, Whig and Tory." Johnny's life with the Lathams had been so limited he knew little of the political strife that was turning in Boston which was turning Boston into two armed camps. The Whigs declaring that taxation without representation is tyranny, and Tories believing all differences could be settled with time, patience, and respect for government. Rab obviously was a Whig. I can stomach some of the Tories, he went on, men like Governor Hutchinson. They honestly think we're better off to take anything from the British Parliament. Let them break us down, stamp in our faces, take all we've got by taxes, and never protest. They say we American colonies are too weak to get on without England's help and guidance. But Governor Hutchinson's a good man. Of course, we'll destroy him. We've marked him down. Sam Adams is already greasing the ways under him. But I can't stand men like Light, who care nothing for anything except themselves and their own fortune, playing both ends against the middle. I'd never have picked him for a relative, but beggars can't be choosers, and happens I'm a beggar. It's on to time to get ready to go to him. Understanding Johnny's unspoken desire not to appear too meanly before the great gentleman, Rab went to the attic above the shop where he slept and came down with a clean shirt of the finest white linen and fawn-colored corduroy jacket with silver buttons. It's too small for me. Ought to about fit you. It did. Almost miraculously, for Johnny had not seen where it came from. Bread and cheese were on the counter. It was his first food since yesterday's gorging. With the straight, fair hair, well brushed and tied behind with a taffeta, the handsome jacket, the frilled, immaculate shirt, Johnny did cut a very presentable figure. By the printing shop clock, the sun had been set for almost an hour. Rab was folding newspapers. You can sleep here, he said, if they don't offer you anything, but good luck, bold fellow. Chapter 4, Section 3. Standing on Beacon Hill, so far removed from the hurly-burly of the wharfs, shops, markets of town, Johnny hesitated. Should he, as a poor, out-of-work apprentice, go around back? Or should he, as a long-lost something or other, raise that gleaming brass knocker on the paneled front door? The silver buttons on Rab's bold fellow heartened him. The knocker fell, and instantly a maid was bidding him to enter, curtsying, asking his name. I'm Jonathan Light Tremaine. The front hall was very large. From it rose a flight of stairs, taking their time in rising, taking all the space they needed. Along the walls were portraits, Merchant Light and his handsome, healthy youth, Lavinia, painted long before in London, as regal a child as now she was a young woman. Time blackened old things, already 100 years old. Was it their long dried blood which now ran red and living in Johnny's veins? To the left was a drawing room. The tinkle of a spigot, low voices, laughter. Could it be they were laughing because the maid was announcing him? He wished he had called himself merely Johnny Tremaine. Ah-ha-ha! That was Merchant Light. Fetch him in, Jenny. Just a little family party. All want to see him, eh? Johnny's first impression was of dozens of wax candles lighting the long, dove-colored and lavender and yellow room. They were reflected in mirrors, silver, gleaming floors, and mahogany. A dozen people were gathered together in the far end of the room. Johnny stood a moment, anxious to do nothing wrong, conscious that the new shoes he had been so proud of did not much resemble the little black buckled plumps on the gentleman. Well, said Mr. Light, rising but not approaching him. So, here we are? Yes, sir. Lavinia, Cousin Talbot, Aunt Bess, how do you like his looks? Aunt Bess, a horrifyingly ugly, cross old woman with two gold-headed canes, vowed through her whiskers and toothless gums that he looked just as bad as she had expected. Lavinia turned from the spinet. She had on a stiff turquoise blue dress that suited her marvelously. She looked at the boy with her head tipped sideways, as Johnny had seen other ladies look at silver teapots before they bought. "At least, Papa, he's a deal handsomer than most of my relatives. Isn't he, Cousin Seawall?" It was the rosy clerk, Lovelorn Seawall, who was turning her music for her. "Yes, daughter." Mr. Light's eyes flickered over Johnny. "Quite the little gentleman, from the waist up. Silver buttons, eh? Ruffled shirt?" His eyes slid over his little family party. He addressed them in so low a voice he seemed to ignore Johnny standing at the far upper end of the long room. He had been expecting some such apparition from the past ever since last August. In spite of family efforts to keep certain things dark, he had reason to believe certain things were well known, even among the lower classes. Then he called to Johnny. "Now, boy, you brought your cup? It's here in this bag. Very good. Will you, and all of you, please step into the dining room?" This took some time, for Aunt Bess had to be pulled in front and pushed from behind before she was balanced on her two gold-headed canes. She scolded, muttered, and shook her whiskers at everyone, including her famous nephew. Only Lavinia, still at the spinet, and Cousin Seawall bending over her, did not go into the dining room. There on the sideboard were 3 standing cups. They were identical with Johnny's. Silently he took his from his bag, set it with the other 3, then stood back and looked at the silken, bejeweled, perfumed folk crowding about him. Mr. Light took up the cup, studied it, compared it with one of his own. Silently he handed it to a plainly dressed, thick-set gentleman who thus far had said nothing. "I think," said Mr. Light quietly, "all of you ladies and gentlemen agree that this is the cup of our cousin, is it? Has brought back tonight. Is one of this set." There was a murmur of assent. Johnny could hear the tiny tinkle, seemingly far away, of Miss Lavinia's spinet. "It is perfectly obvious that this cup now stands where it belongs. The question is, how was it ever separated from its fellows?" Johnny felt that everyone there, except himself, knew the answer to this question. "In fact," the merchant's voice was smooth as oil, "I declare this to be the very cup which was stolen from me by thieves. They broke through yonder window about the 23rd of last August. Sheriff, I order you arrest this boy for burglary." The thick-set, plain man, whom Johnny had already noticed, put a heavy hand on his shoulder. His formal words flowed over him. "Johnny Tremaine, alias Jonathan Light Tremaine, apprentice to Ephraim Lapham, name of King and Bay Colony, standing cup, taken away the 23rd day, month, year of our Lord 1773. "This is not true," Johnny said. "You can explain to the judge." "Very well, I can and I will." The full horror of the accusation, for a boy might be hanged for stealing a silver cup, froze him into seemingly nonchalance. This coolness had made a bad impression. Aunt Bess was poking at him with one of her canes. She hoped she'd live long enough to see him hanged. He was a perfect little viper, and he looked it. A florid woman was flapping a pink feather fan. She thought he had one of those falsely innocent little faces that were such an aid to evil boys. "No," someone else was saying, "he has a shifty eye." Aunt Bess croaked, "Look at those silver buttons on his coat. I'm sure he stole them." Mr. Light said, "Boy, where did you get that coat?" "It was lent to me." "Lent you? By whom, pray?" "A printer's boy. I don't know his name. Down at the Observer office. I don't know his last name. Down at the Observer's office. He's called Rab." "This coat is worth money. Do you think someone whose last name you admit you don't know would lend you a coat?" "It doesn't sound likely, but it happens it's true." "Sheriff, look into this." "I certainly will, Mr. Light." I sent Seawall over to the Laphams, a very respectable, humble, pious, poor sort of folk. Mrs. Latham swore this boy never owned a thing but the clothes he stood in. As for his name, she showed Sewell the papers of his indenture signed by his dead mother. She put him down as Johnny Tremaine. No Jonathan Light about it. And Mrs. Latham believed that lately he had taken to evil things, stealing shoes and little things. She swore he'd never owned a cup. And Mr. Tweedy, a partner of old Mr. Latham, said the boy was a notorious liar and of most evil rapport. The sheriff was taking out the handcuffs, snapping them on Johnny's wrist and his own. "Soon's I get this scamp locked up, I'll be back for the bowl of punch you promised, Mr. Light," he called cheerfully as he left. The last sound Johnny heard was the fairy tinkle of the spinet. The chain clanked. The sheriff said nothing until they reached the stone jail on Prison Lane. Then, as the jailer was writing down Johnny's name in his book, the sheriff said kindly, "Now, boy, you've got some rights. Who do you want notified? Got any kin except the Lights, eh? How about old Mr. Latham?" "He's my master, no more. He dismissed me months ago." "Relatives? Parents?" "I've nothing. But will you please tell the boy down at the Observer? He's a tall boy and dark. All I know is that his name is Rab." "The one you stole the coat off, hey? I was going to look him up tonight." Section 4. Oddly enough, Johnny slept well on his straw pallet in the jail. The night before, lying and weeping among the graves of Copp's Hill, he had reached bottom. He could not go lower than that. No matter what happened, he could not help but now go up. He knew Azana's childish squeals were nothing compared to the serious charge Mr. Light had brought against him, but the squeals had just about broken his heart. The accusation of burglary he could take. He felt tough enough and hard enough to take anything, but he could not help but think of the gallows just beyond the town's gates. How they had loomed up at him through the dark of the night like a warning. Before he had finished his breakfast of corn gruel, Rab arrived. Johnny had known he would come. He brought blankets, books, food. Seemingly, by the nonchalance of his manner, nothing was more usual than to find one's friends in jail. About his muscular brown throat, Johnny could see a medal hung upon a string, and on it was engraved a tree of liberty. So Rab was one of the semi-secret famous Sons of Liberty, those carefully organized mobs who often took justice into their own hands. They frightened royal officers out of Boston, stopped British admirals from impressing Yankee seamen as they were impressed in England. They could at will paralyze trade, courts, government. Many a night Johnny had heard their whistles, conch shells, and cries of town-born turnout, the running of their feet. The next day he had seen the effigies they had hung, the Tory fences they had torn down, or windows broken, and heard that Royal Commissioner so-and-so had been frightened out of Boston, or such and such a merchant had wept when hailed before the Liberty Tree, and swore never to do trade with England until all grievances had been righted. The Lathams had hated such lawless seizure of government by the Sons of Liberty. Johnny had not thought much about it. Seeing the medal at Rab's throat made him think it might be fun to be out with them. The medal did its work for both the turnkey and the jailer, who were also sons. Johnny was given a neat private room on the ground floor. Such rooms are usually reserved for gentlemen jailed for debt. Here he told Rab his entire story. Rab had already found out that the case would come up on the following Tuesday before Mr. Justice Dana. If Mr. Justice thought there was no sufficient evidence to hold him for a higher court and a jury trial, he would immediately release him. Then he asked if Johnny had shown his cup to any living soul sometime before August 23rd. Such a witness would prove that Johnny had owned the cup before Mr. Light's had been stolen. Why, of course, Cilla Latham. That was July, come to think, and it was the very day Mr. Hancock ordered his sugar basin. It was the 2nd day of July. That was a Tuesday. That's all you need. Mr. Light was a fool to bring so flimsy a charge against you. What do you suppose he meant when he said he had expected something like me turning up as soon as that cup were stolen? I don't know what goes on in that clever, bad head, but perhaps he thinks you're an impostor and stole the cup first to back up some claim of kinship. Of course Scylla will come to court for you. She will, if her mother will let her. Would Mrs. Lapham give you a good character? No. She thinks these days I'm bad enough to steal a wig off a person's head. Next day, Rab was back at the same time. He was a little perturbed. Mr. Light himself had been to the Laphams in the Ruby coach and ordered a dozen silver spoons, a tea caddy, and if all went well, would order a silver tankard a foot high. A bribe? Scylla said he pays in advance. Then it was Mrs. Lapham said she would not have her girl mixed up in such a disgraceful case. She promised Scylla would spend next Tuesday under lock and key. I could hang first. And she is determined to please that Mr. Tweedy, too. If he won't sign that contract and get right to work, she can't get Mr. Light's silver made. Poor old Mr. Lapham won't do anything but read his Bible. Says he hasn't long to prepare to meet his Maker. By the way, Mr. Tweedy just about hates you. Says you called him a squeak pig. He didn't like it. Of course I called him a squeak pig. Don't see why. He cares. Well, you go around calling people squeak pigs, and you've just about got to take it when they hit back. Not with their tongues. Mostly, they're not quick enough, but like this. Tweedy saw his chance to get back at you. He says if Mrs. Lapham lets Scylla testify for you, he'll take a ship back to Baltimore. Says he's sensitive and a great artist, and he can't be upset by thieves and brawlers. Well, never mind. But I don't see the point of going around and, oh, forget those squeak pigs for heaven's sake. Johnny was sulky. Now for a lawyer. I've talked to Josiah Quincy. He often writes for the Observer. He says if you want him, he's ready. Josiah Quincy? But, Rab, you tell him not to. You don't want him? He's the best young lawyer in Boston. I could never pay him. You don't understand. He'll give you his time for nothing. He's coming to see you this afternoon, and I'm meeting Scylla, sort of behind her mother's back to make plans. It all depends on Scylla, doesn't it? Well, pretty much. And Mrs. Lapham and the squeak, Tweedy, say they'll lock her up, and so I can't get her out. Boy, I could get her out of this jail. Get her out of the Tower of London, and that girl would testify for you, even if it cost her life. What's her real name? Priscilla? Well, may Priscilla be on my side if ever I'm accused of anything. What about the little girl? Is she really as bright as she looks? No, I don't think so. She's just sort of a parrot. She's always going around repeating what Scylla or anyone else says to her, as if she had thought it up all herself. Chapter 4, Section 5. Mr. Justice Dana was a stout and florid man, dressed in a black silk robe and a great woolly white wig. Johnny sat close to Mr. Quincy, watching the justice's nervous, taut hands, listening to his what have we heres and quick questions to the men and women shoved up before him. Some people he dismissed, some he ordered fined, or whipped, or set in the stocks, or held for higher court. Johnny knew when his own case would be soon called because he heard the justice tell a beadle to run down to the Long Wharf and tell Merchant Light to present himself in half an hour. Once again, Johnny squirmed about, studying every face in the courtroom. Rab and Scylla were not there, and he was frightened. Mr. Quincy whispered to him. Rab said he'd get her here by 11. Rab's never slipped yet. Johnny liked his young lawyer, a frail man, flushed with fever. His cough was prophetic as of an early death. That was how Johnny's mother had died, burned up by fever, coughing herself to death. The man had a mobile, passionate face, handsome except for one wall eye. Mr. Light arrived, escorted by his poor relative and clerk Seawall. He entered as though he owned the court, calling a cheery good morning to Mr. Justice, interrupting the mumbled explanation of a shabby bakeress accused of selling moldy bread. Next there was a rattle of light gig wheels, a jingle of horse gear, and to the intense pleasure of everyone, Miss Lavinia Light entered, and as modestly as she was able, took a seat near the door. Even the justice straightened the bands in his throat. Seawall blushed. The bakeress forgot what she was saying as she turned to gape at the beautiful dark woman, darkly dressed. Restless, easily bored, Miss Light often did unexpected things. Jonathan Light versus Johnny Tremaine, alias Jonathan Light Tremaine. Mr. Quincy gave him a secret pat on the knee. Johnny knew he must now step forward, take his oath on the Bible, and tell the truth, the whole truth, so help him God. He was frightened, for as he stepped forward, he was conscious that these might be the first steps toward the gallows, waiting in the dark beyond the town gates. Mr. Light was called and was taking the same oath. Mr. Quincy's one good eye caught Johnny's. He was forming words on his lips. The clock had indeed struck 11, and there, standing in the doorway, were Rab and Scylla. Rab, enigmatical, dark, capable, looked as always. Scylla had on a hood that half covered her face. Mr. Light was talking as informally as though he and Mr. Dana were alone together, sitting at a tavern, cracking walnuts, drinking Madeira. He told how his great-grandfather, Jonathan Light, mayor of Causeway, Kent, England, had had 6 identical cups made, one for each of his sons. 4 of these cups had come to his country, and these he had himself owned until last August. On the night of the 23rd, a thief or thieves had broken a pane out of his dining-room window. The space was too small to admit a grown man, so it was a half-grown boy who had slipped in and taken only one of the famous cups. Then he snapped his fingers at Seawall, who stepped forward to set the 4 cups on the table before the justice. "This is the stolen cup," Mr. Light said confidently. "I've tied a red ribbon on it." Then he went on to tell, with considerable humor and a bright sparkle in his slippery black eyes, about Johnny's visit to his shop, his claims of kinship, and how he had lured him to his house with the stolen cup. The justice said, "Mr. Light, could it not be possible that this boy is related to you? Could his story be true?" No, it was impossible. Would Mr. Justice Dana be so good as to glance at this indenture which the boy's erstwhile master, Mr. Lapham, had been so kind as to lend him? The name was put down as Johnny Tremaine. Nothing about Light. Undoubtedly, older heads than this boy's had egged him on to this wretched, scurvy trick. But Mr. Light had no wish to go into the matter beyond the recovery of his own property. He did not wish to suggest in any way that the Laphams had any part in the imposture. They were very humble, honest, pious folk. He believed that the case of the theft, all that interested him at the moment, was dead open and shut case against the boy. And might he ask the death penalty? There was too much thieving going on in Boston. Poor apprentices were getting out of hand. The gallows had been too long empty. "That's for the court to say," the justice said sourly. He took snuff, and Mr. Light took snuff. They sneezed together. Mr. Quincy led Johnny on to tell his own story. The boy spoke confidently, now that Rab and Scylla were there. He had never had an audience before, and he felt the courtroom hanging on his words, believing him. He spoke better and better. He told how his mother had given him the cup. The little that she had told him, she had bidden him not to part with the cup, ever, nor ever to go to the lights, unless he had come to the end of everything. Then he spoke simply and easily of his accident, his hunt for work, his despair and arrest. There was a murmur, almost of applause. "Johnny," said Mr. Quincy, "did you obey your mother? Never show your cup to anyone." "Once I disobeyed. It was on the 2nd day of last July. I forgot or didn't heed. I told my master's daughter, Priscilla Lapham, what my mother said was my true name, and about the cup. So she wanted to see it. It was just dawn, that is, the dawn of the 3rd of July, Tuesday it was." Scylla was called. Johnny had always thought her a shy girl, but she stood up straight before the judge, speaking in her clear, low voice. He was proud of her, and he had always thought her a skinny, plain girl. She looked at the moment just about beautiful to him. As she finished, there was a sensation in the courtroom that outweighed the arrival of Mr. Light and even his handsome daughter. Izana, her bright curls in wild array, flew into the courtroom, seeming like a mouse to run without feet. She stopped for no oath nor formalities, but flung herself upon Mr. Justice Dana, telling over again Scylla's story. Johnny knew she had been sound asleep when he had told Scylla. She had even been in bed when he had actually shown the cup to her older sister. He was amazed at the vividness of her jumbled recital and touched by the virtues she attributed to himself. Yet she was making it all up. In vain Mr. Justice Dana's "What do we have here?" and "I cannot accept this as testimony," and Scylla's attempts to quiet her. She was so enchanting, so seemingly come from another world, she had her say. "Bless me," said Mr. Justice, blowing his nose, "and how old might you be?" "8, sir, going on for 9. There now, be a good girl here. You take this piece of licorice I have in my pocket and sit down quietly and eat it. There." Almost immediately he dismissed the case. There was not the slightest evidence the justice was saying that the accused had stolen a cup, nor that the cup with the red ribbon, now illegally in the possession of Mr. Light, was the same one that was stolen from his house last August. Evidence against that, for these young Lapham misses, has proved to his satisfaction. And might he point out to Mr. Light his own testimony about the high character and honesty and piety of the Laphams enjoyed? That, unlikely as it might seem, the apprentice had possession of a silver cup, undoubtedly one of the original 6, ordered by the mayor of Causeway, Kent. He bade Johnny Tremaine take the one with the red ribbon. It was his own. If he liked, he might even bring a suit against Mr. Light. Didn't recommend it. Mr. Light was too powerful. Johnny took the cup. In a moment he and Mr. Quincy, Rab, and Scylla were standing in the sunshine of the street outside the courthouse. They were so happy they could only laugh. The lawyer said now they would all go together as his guests to a tavern to eat at their leisure and drink a health to Johnny from the cup. But where was Izana? She was standing with a tiny hand in one of Miss Light's gloved ones, gazing up at her in admiration. Scylla called her crossly. Mrs. Light stepped up into her high gig. It was a long step, but she was a lithe, long-legged woman. "She said," panted Izana, "she'd never seen anything like me, not even in some lane in London." "Drury Lane," said the young Mr. Quincy dryly. "I was thinking that myself." "Rab," said the little girl, "was I really all right?" "Just about perfect, only some of it you put in the first person, so it wasn't quite the truth, but you'll never starve." Then she tried to kiss Johnny, but he thought it beneath his dignity to be kissed on the street. "You're too mussed up with licorice," she said. She bent and kissed his burned hand. He said nothing. He suddenly was afraid he might cry. So, that is the end of chapter 4. I want you to go ahead and fill out the following journal prompt. Have you ever had someone reject you for any reason? What did it feel like? Have you ever had anyone reject you, and what did it feel like? Put a journal entry on a piece of paper and a Google Doc and attach it to the chapter 4 journal entry assignment on Jupyter, and then also do the chapter 4 study questions. See you soon.